Greetings, family. Hotep. It's Brother Bobby coming to you again live. And this segment, we'll be talking about the most difficult topic to talk about in our history, the African slave trade. This will be a little bit longer than normal. I dedicate this to the ancestors, all those who have gone on, who've passed. We need to understand that libation is very important. This is where we honor the ancestors with water pouring it into the earth. Also give thanks to the Creator. We call him Yah. We don't call him God because God is an English name, and also, as you know, you spell the word God backwards, it's dog, and there's a story behind that as well. We're not going to get into that. We know that they call him Prophet Muhammad, which is the Muslim term. So we have lots of terms that we use. Shango is one of them also, which we call the Most High. So there are many different names and variations of the story, but I pay homage to all of those that we have paid respect to in our time, in our history. So we're again going to be talking about the African slave trade, one of the most difficult topics to talk about. Now, first and foremost, you must understand we as a people have went through quite a bit, and we need to understand that this damage that has taken place due to the slave trade is still around to this day. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is very real, and the majority of us walking around the United States and in this hemisphere are suffering from post-traumatic slave syndrome. While the American Medical and Psychological and Psychiatry Associations all agree among themselves that we have no mental illness, we do have a mental illness. But again, without further ado, we'll be dealing with the African slave trade. Now, it is true that the Europeans did not first start the slave trade, but the Europeans would perfect the slave trade. Some of the things that took place in the slave trade to us is some of the most horrific events in the history. It must be addressed first before I get into the African slave trade that the Jewish Holocaust, 1939 to 1945, it is not the most horrific event in the annals of history. That's for approximately 5 to 6 years, depending on which historian you want to listen to. 1939 to 1945 is where most people agree on it, which is during World War II. It's estimated that 6 million Jews would be killed at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau, and other places around Germany as well. But again, the most horrific happened to us in this hemisphere. Now, the number of those that were affected, no historian can give you accurate numbers. Why? Because the manifests were not kept accurately, but it is estimated at least 10 million, and it can be as high as 600 million or more. Now, for those of you that's saying, I find that far-fetched, I can't believe that. Well, here's something for you to think about. Slave ships were built to hold on average 400 to 500 of our ancestors. They were packed like sardines. If ships are leaving out of ports every single day, do the math. 1441 to 1809 if you're looking for United States history, but we know that it went well past 1809. So we don't know for sure how many of our ancestors were taken out, butchered, raped, murdered, fed to the sharks. This is one of the reasons why sharks attack people to this day, especially in this hemisphere, because of human consumption of sharks, because many of our ancestors jumped overboard or they were thrown overboard because of illness. Now, when did the slave trade of us begin? 1441, a Portuguese sailor by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator would kidnap 20 of our ancestors and take them back to Portugal. And of course, he would give them to a pope. The Catholic Church was instrumental in our enslavement. Now, would they be the first? No. It would be the Arabs, and the Arabs were just as horrific with our ancestors. But the reason why the emphasis is placed more on the Europeans, because they are the ones who benefit the most from the slave trade, and no one benefited more than the Catholic Church, the Jews in the United States. Yes, and I will be elaborating on each one. So in 1441, again, Prince Henry the Navigator would take 20 of our ancestors to Portugal, and he would give them to, as we call, the Pope. Now, once they came to this hemisphere, to the Americas, and of course the Portuguese and the English, of course, which is also Britain, they were involved. Uh, Everyone with the exception of Russia. Russia was not really involved in the slave trade, and neither was, as we call China. They were not really involved in the slave trade per se. But the majority of European nations were involved and became extremely wealthy. This is where their wealth would come from. So once they came into this hemisphere aboard those many ships, and most of those ships were financed by the Jews. Now, the first book that I'm going to show you pertaining to what I'm talking about now about the Jews, so we have no debate whatsoever, is a book that the Jews and most of European America is very familiar with, and this is the book right here. It is The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. Now, this is a book that was once used by many scholars in some of the schools in the college, on the college level. And of course, they were attacked for using this book. But this is a very much needed book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. As a matter of fact, in this book, it talks about the census, and the census of 1820 stated that every Jew in the United States owned at least 3 slaves. And the majority of your slave ships that were financed by Jews. And if you take a note at the information inside this book, you will find out that the majority of the slave ships were named after so-called deities of their creation. So this is a very much needed book, so you can totally understand the history of the Jewish involvement in the slave trade. So, with that taking place here in the United States, wealth was starting to grow. Now, as far as the slavery here in the United States is concerned, there are many atrocities that would take place, and we'll also get into some of those atrocities that would take place. One of the first things they had to do once they brought us here into the United States, they have to do what was called seasoning. Seasoning is nothing more where they would have our ancestors placed with slaves that had already been indoctrinated, and they would indoctrinate them. What would they do? They would take away their original diet. We were extremely healthy eating people. We ate more vegetation than we did flesh. Matter of fact, a lot of flesh was not in our diet. But of course, when we came here, as Brother Malcolm said, they had us to clean out the hog, and they would cook the pig, and we ate what Malcolm called the guts, which we today call chitlins. That's the truth about it. And some of the words that we use involving our history, especially during the slave trade, such as the word picnic, pick a nigger. And in many cases, they actually would roast and feast upon our ancestors. That is correct. They would actually eat our ancestors. And many of the pictures that you see where black men were hung, you'll notice sometimes that their pants were dangling down to their ankles. And the reason for this, because they would castrate the male. What was the purpose of this castration? Well, in many cases, it was kept as a souvenir. In some cases, it was actually eating. It was eaten. It was consumed because it was believed that they would connect and get the melanin that is found in our skin. Many people know that the melanin in our skin is there for various reasons, especially for the sun. We do not need sunblock. We do not need sunscreen lotion. Any of those things we do not need. We simply need heat, something to cover our head from the extreme heat, and water. That is all that we need. So that being said, these are 2 of the words that we use. So back to the enslavement of our ancestors. It was a 3-month journey usually across what was called at that particular time the Ethiopian Sea. Today they call it the Atlantic Ocean. Now it was called the African Slave Triangle. The triangle was from Europe to the west coast of El Kibalon, which we call Africa, and of course to South and Central America and back across the sea. That was the African slave trade. To this very day, many people are not aware of this information. The meteorologists, or the weatherman as we know, they know this, but they don't normally tell you this, that every hurricane starts along the west coast of the motherland, El Kibalon, Africa, and follow the exact same path as the slave ships. And it would come here, and it would, of course, tear up most of the east coast and along the ports where they would actually drop off our ancestors. Now, once again, for those that don't believe that these numbers are as high as they are, 600 million or possibly more, one of the cities that was actually created, Liverpool, England, was created specifically for the slave trade. The majority of our ancestors, over 60%, would go through Liverpool. So Liverpool is still in existence to this day, and many of us are not aware of this. Now, when you look at the city of Petersburg, where I'm from, Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, Virginia has more of our history than any city in the United States. And many people that live right here in the city are not aware of that. So what are the things that took place here in Petersburg? Well, the oldest black community is here in Petersburg. The oldest black church ever created is here in Petersburg. The second oldest church in the United States is here in Petersburg. The last major battle of the Civil War took place right here in Petersburg. One of the HBCUs is right here in Petersburg. One of the most noticed mental assignments for black folk is right here in Petersburg, Central State Hospital. And it goes on and on and on. I advise everyone in America, once you see this, to visit Petersburg, Virginia and learn your story. Now, one of the things that bothered me back in 2005, I went to the Jewish Holocaust Museum that's in Washington, D.C. I know of two museums in this country for the Jews. One is in Richmond, Virginia, which is 22 miles north of Petersburg, and the other one is in Washington, D.C. I went to the one in Washington, D.C. I was very upset, and the reason I was upset because the first two things I noticed when I went into the Jewish Holocaust Museum, number one, the majority of those that were on security were us. Number two, the majority that I saw throughout the museum, again, was us. Here's the issue with that. You're crying about a people who went through something that lasted for 6 years, but you're not crying about what happened to yourself that is still ongoing to this very day, the worst atrocity ever. And also, the icing on the cake, as they would say, those very people that you're crying about are the ones that have benefited and still benefit from what has happened to us. So to me, it showed the mental damage that we have. So again, it is time to return back to the fold and learn your story. So once the Jews became acquainted with the structure for enslaving people and the nuances that was involved in it, they continued on with it. And of course, they would bury their history as deeply as they could. But also, we cannot allow the Catholic Church to escape either, because the Catholic Church was also very beneficial. Well, how? Well, there's a man in the history by the name of Bartolome de las Casas. And Bartolome de las Casas was 15 years old. And he said when he saw what was happening to the indigenous people, especially here in this hemisphere, who they call Indians, who are again the Arawak Haitians, he said, this is an atrocity, it needs to stop. But it is okay to enslave the heathens of El Kibalan. So, of course, the Pope at that particular time went along with this. And so once that was accepted, the African slave trade was accepted by the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church as well started to benefit from the enslavement of our ancestors. And many popes and many people in the Catholic faith had slaves themselves. This is very much documented. Now, also, it must be noted that religion played a major part of our enslavement, because all the religions were founded and based off of African understanding. The understanding of right and wrong is a concept that was created by the Ethiopian people. So if we are the original people on the planet and all the history books validate that, but they don't put a lot of emphasis on that, you're telling me that the Creator placed us here and we didn't have any understanding of who the Father was and the story? That makes no sense whatsoever. Again, it must be elaborated that there is a world war against the role of African people in the diaspora. We must learn our history. There were three men that were instrumental in the Catholic Church with creating what we today know as Christianity. That is Tertullian, St. Augustine, and Cyprian. This book, African Glory, is one of the books that touches on that. This is a must. You must get this book and you must go through this book to read and understand what exactly took place with religion. Who was St. Augustine, Tertullian, and Cyprian? Of course, there are many books that are out there, and I have many books, but you will only be seeing a few books each time that I will speak to you. Continuing on. So, we now have this religion, Christianity, which was founded by three black men. We taught this into the Europeans. The Europeans went off, they constructed something, and of course we called him Jesus, and history has validated there's no historical evidence ever of a man by that name, and there are many sources that validate that story. Of course, many of us refuse to accept that. Not upset with that whatsoever. But I think Dr. Clark, once again, something that makes a lot of sense. He said, don't get mad. Prove me wrong. So you don't see the religious scholars coming out to challenge the historian. Why? Well, you don't have the text. The historians have all the text. Now, are the historians saying that there were no deities? There was no one walked the planet and did these things? No, we're not saying that. We're saying there are and there were. We're simply saying that the ones that we know are the ones that they gave us. So they took our story, they changed the people that were actually in the text, and they gave us something new. That is all we're simply saying. So once they seasoned us, they gave us their form of Christianity and had us praying to their deity, who is someone that looks like them. And I don't understand why, if this man was real, this man truly existed, why did he allow the slave trade to take place? This is the worst atrocity in history, and the one that you told us that we need to pray to was never there for us through all our afflictions that still are continuing to this day. So with the slave trade, we're still here in this United States of America. And as the slave trade would take place, and as people continue to come into this country, well, the North were the first really to benefit from the slave trade. Yes, not the South, but the North. As a matter of fact, Wall Street, the reason why it's called Wall Street, because there was actually a wall that was there. All the people in New York are very much aware of this history, or should be aware of this history. And on one side of that wall, our ancestors were being sold. And on the other side, you had the aristocrats, the well-to-do white society, who heard the cries of the black mother as their child was being ripped out of their arms, and the black man as he was being whooped to be submissive. And of course, they were sold like cattle on the other side of that wall. Thus, you have Wall Street. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, we have to go back to the books and learn our history. So once the slavery in the North stopped, then the slavery in the South continued. But as it continued to grow and prosper, one of the problems that those in the North had was they could not keep up with their products like the South. Why? The South had free labor. Understand the math when it comes to our enslavement here in the United States. Many people say it's 400 years. Some people say it's more than 400 years. Well, the breakdown is as thus. 246 years of enslavement, that's the slavery. 100 years of lynching. 100 years of lynching and 50 years of segregation. That totals 396 years. So we're supposed to have been emancipated in 1865. That's when we were supposed to be emancipated, in 1865. But were we really emancipated? Well, I would strongly advise everyone to simply read the 13th Amendment. And there is one word in that 13th Amendment that will grab your attention. Involuntary servitude or slavery shall be abolished except for a crime or punishment. What does that mean? Well, even back then, you must say that the politicians of America were very shrewd. They slipped that word except in there because they would, once the slavery ended with the chains, they still had a way of enslaving us by simply creating laws and putting words in that we did not quite understand, because even to this day, we still have a hard time with English. Why? We were not writing from left to right. We were writing from right to left, and we spoke many languages, and English was not one of them. English is one of the worst languages on the planet. As a matter of fact, it's called the bastard language. Why? It stole from everyone. It doesn't even have a mother and father. It just have one or the other. Choose one, the other doesn't exist. So we're still working on this English thing. So that being said, we continue on with this story. So we had many presidents that came along during the slave trade. Many talked about freedoms eventually for our ancestors. And of course, the most notable one is Abraham Lincoln. And without a shadow of a doubt, and many know this as well, that Abraham Lincoln was one of the worst bigots in our history, and he did more damage to us than any president in United States history. That being said, but we must look at some of the presidents who came before Lincoln, who did some things that's not very much noted, not even in the textbook, and they don't teach in school. Let's start with, as a matter of fact, his predecessor. His predecessor, the one who came before him, was James Buchanan. James Buchanan, the first president of the United States and only president of the United States, who was not married. And his mate was the vice president of the previous administration to him, who was Franklin Pierce. That's correct. He was having an affair with the former vice president under Franklin Pierce. So who represented the first lady? It was his niece. It was his niece. So what did James Buchanan do? Well, he signed the second 13th Amendment. Yes, there were actually three 13th Amendments. The second 13th Amendment was called the Perpetual Amendment. The Perpetual Amendment simply stated that they were not going to interfere with the enslavement of those that were in the South, and slavery would be forever with no other recourse. There was no other way to emancipate the slaves because James Buchanan would sign this. Can you find this information? Yes, you can. It's readily available on the internet. You simply put in the 13th Amendment, Perpetual Amendment, James Buchanan, and you will find it, and you will see that they have this document in their archives in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the reasons why you do not know this information is because, again, like I stated on my first clip, you are not listening to the historians and the history teachers that know the information. You're listening to people that have sold out or don't really know the history. Those that are in the school system, those are the ones who went through the education system for his story and are teaching his story in the school system. This is why you don't know this information. So, the enslavement of our ancestors. The enslavement of our ancestors started in 1441 and concluded here in the United States, supposedly on paper in 1809, but then again with what we say the 13th Amendment, which was the third 13th Amendment, the emancipation of our ancestors would take place. Now, of course, there are way more details involved in the slave trade. There's way much information I can touch on. There are two other books I would like for you to see, and with that, I will conclude. Next one is From Babylon to Timbuktu. Very much needed book. Babylon to Timbuktu. And it's talking about the Jews and what exactly the Jews did as far as our history is concerned. It's a must read. From Babylon to Timbuktu. And lastly, the African Holocaust, the Holocaust for beginners. The Holocaust for beginners. These are 4 books, and this is the 4th one that I would strongly suggest that you would purchase immediately. Now, if you would like to have further information about this or any other topic concerning our history, I'm available for lectures. My email is shalomo1@yahoo.com. That is SHOLOMHO1@yahoo.com. Again, that is Shalomo1, which is SHOLOMHO1@yahoo.com. I'm available for lectures across the country. I do PowerPoint presentations so you can see the documents, the pictures, and everything that goes along with it. So until next time, Hotep.